Righty. Hello, everyone. Welcome to GIA's annual research on support for arts and culture. My name is Jamie Sharp, and I am the program manager here at GIA. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a light-skinned Black person in my 20s. I have short, curly, dark hair, and I am wearing a blue floral sweater with blue earrings to match. GIA is headquartered on the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. We ask you to join in acknowledging the Lenape and Wappinger communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Just a few logistical things before we introduce our speakers. Today's webinar will be recorded and shared out, so if you have to hop off early, no worries, if you have colleagues that weren't able to join us today. And before we begin, I also just want to take a minute to review the Zoom features. If you have a question for our tech team during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function and message LGC Tech Jessica. Otherwise, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our presenters. I do want to note that we have two presentations today, and we will hold all questions until the end for our Q&A portion. And if you would like your experience to include live captioning, please select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. GIA's annual Arts Funding Snapshot is now available in the GIA Reader, featuring foundation grants to Arts and Culture 2022 based on the most recent completed year of Candid data, and public funding for the Arts 2024 prepared by the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. How have things changed since the last GIA funder snapshots in February and October 2024, and what can we look forward to in 2025? We also want to acknowledge that there are active changes afoot in the funding landscape at the federal level that impact many funders, and the data presented today will highlight the significance of funding at every level of government and public-private collaboration to support cultural funding. Today, we will hear from consultant Stephen Lawrence, as well as Mohja Rhoads, the research director at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and Nakyung Rhee, the research manager at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Stephen.
Well, thank you, Jamie. It's good to be back with all of you. I think Mohja and Nakyung may have the most salient parts of today's presentation. So I will, quickly go through what we're seeing on the foundation front, but it's always a pleasure to be here. And, I always state this, and I will continue to have such a great appreciation for the arts community and the interest that they have in data and really understanding how that can help to inform their work and understand what's happening in the sector. So with that, what we're going to look at today is foundation giving data through 2022 to see what's been happening. This is based on the Candid's Foundation 1000 grant sample, and I want to acknowledge my friends and former colleagues at Candid who help to provide these data every year. This data set, it's not all U.S. foundations, but it does include 1,000 of the largest. All of their grants of $10,000 or more. It accounts for roughly 2/5 of all giving by private and community foundations. And this totaled close to $51 billion in 2022, which is just an astounding amount. All right. Let's look at shares of giving for arts and culture, and really just to sort of preview what we're seeing. In the last couple of cycles, we saw the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that that had on arts funding. What I feel like we're looking at as of 2022 is a return to normal as far as foundation support for arts and culture goes, although that return to normal is not ideal necessarily. So let's start taking a look at the numbers. This chart is illustrating the share of grant dollars in the Foundation 1000 that focus on arts and culture, either have a primary or secondary focus on arts and culture. And as you can see, this share has been declining, and in the latest year for which we have data, 2022, it dipped further. It's under 7%. It's the lowest share that Candid and prior to it Foundation Center has ever tracked, focused on arts and culture. So this has been more or less continuing a trend we've seen over the past decade or more. As you can see, back in 2010, 13% of grant dollars in the Foundation 1000 focused on arts and culture. We had an exceptionally large billion-dollar grant that year from Walton Family Foundation to Crystal Bridges. And that compares to the latest year when the largest grant we tracked was a $30 million general support award from the David Geffen Foundation to Lincoln Center. The share, just to remind you, the share of foundation funding for arts and culture among these largest foundations was roughly 13 to 14% for the first half of the 2000s, although it had dropped to around 12% by the time of the Great Recession. But clearly, we've continued to go down from there. In terms of share of number of grants, similarly, we actually saw an uptick between 2020 and 2021, but that has dipped again a bit to just over 10% of the share of number of grants. We look at share of number of grants because they're not that figure is not impacted by the size of especially large awards. This is how many grants are coming in. So this is, between these factors, we'll still note that 10% share is above what we saw in 2020. Of course, in 2020, that's when we saw all of that exceptional COVID giving for human services, other types of supports at the onset of the pandemic. And, regardless, in terms of share, we continue to be well below where we were as recently as 2018. All right, let's now turn and look at actual dollars for arts and culture. Well, compared to 2010, we can see that 2020 giving is almost $1 billion more in current dollars without adjusting for inflation. It's actually down a bit from what we saw in 2021, but still a substantial amount. But of course, there's been inflation. So the next slide then illustrates where we're at in terms of giving in the latest year. So basically, between 2010 and 2022, if you look at it, you'd say, well, there's about $100 billion more in giving. So it's a little bit ahead of inflation. You can see it's varied year to year. But for that reason, I think that's part of why while the share of giving for arts and culture has been declining, it doesn't necessarily feel like there are fewer dollars. Because in fact, even adjusting for inflation, the dollars are up a bit. And of course, without inflation, it looks much higher. What's important to keep in mind, though, is looking at that 2022 figure, if arts and culture giving had grown at the same pace as overall giving that's been tracked in the Foundation 1000 across all issue areas, the increase would have been about 74% higher. The overall increase was 74% after inflation. What that would mean for arts and culture is that instead of seeing 2.5 billion inflation adjusted, you'd see 4.2 billion, or almost $1.7 billion more in foundation funding going to arts and culture. Now, I've noted this in the prior presentations on the arts funding snapshot, but I think it's worth revisiting that when we looked at arts funding in greater detail in the Arts Funding at 25 report, I've tried to look at factors that were accounting for the trends we were seeing in overall arts and culture funding. What I found is that among the largest funders that I looked at over the period studied, which was 2000 to 2014, there wasn't much attrition. The arts funders who were involved in 2000 were still funding the arts in 2014, but the share of their overall funding they were providing for arts and culture had often decreased. They were allocating a smaller share of funding. I also looked at funding for arts and culture by period of establishment and saw that, for example, foundations established in the 1990s, 80% funded arts and culture. whereas for those established from 2000 onward, the share was 63%, which raises a question as to why arts and culture is not attracting as much interest among these newer donors. Another view on the data is looking at the change in giving for arts and culture. And it's interesting because in hindsight, I would have put the slide in that I showed last year because it was actually interesting. We're comparing with the blue bars, growth on the left, grant dollars, and on the right, growth, a number of grants among a matched set of 906 Foundation 1000 funders. So these are foundations that were in both the 2021 and 2022 data sets. So we get a more consistent picture. And then the yellow bars are illustrating the change specifically for arts. And when we looked at this for 2021, both all giving and arts giving showed positive growth by grant dollars and number of grants, and they were fairly similar in terms of the scale of growth, which was actually a rather optimistic sign. What we've seen with the 2022 data is a return to the more typical patterns we'd been seeing in recent years, which is while overall grant dollars and number of grants were growing, grant dollars and number of grants for the arts were not. They're either growing more modestly or they were decreasing, as we see for both grant dollars and number of grants with this slide. And it's a real question as to, why, particularly when you look at that share of number of grants, it really does make me wonder, like, how are funders thinking about arts and culture, and why isn't it resonating more in this moment as being a critical area of focus, particularly as we think about the essential role that the arts play in social justice movements and in social change. So it does raise that question as to, is there a disconnect? All right. I now want to turn, just because I find this fascinating, to looking at where arts funding is coming from by foundation type. And it looks like community foundations got cut off in this slide. But this was looking at the share of arts and culture funding by type in 2010. You can see the vast majority is being provided by independent and family foundations. Corporate and operating foundations are accounting for about a quarter of that share, with the balance being provided about 5% by community foundations. Well, when we get to 2022, you can see how that picture has changed. Independent and family foundations are still far and away providing the largest share, but corporate and operating foundations combined are accounting for about 5%. Community foundations, meanwhile, and I think this clearly reflects the growth of wealthy individuals, the number and share of wealthy individuals in the country and who are choosing community foundations as a vehicle for their philanthropy. You can see that share has now gone up to about a fifth. And it's interesting because among the top community foundations funding arts and culture, two are located in California, the California Community Foundation and Silicon Valley Community Foundation. They're ranked third and fifth among all arts funders, respectively. Ranked fourth is the Chicago Community Trust. The other piece, though, I would say is, I think the corporate philanthropy piece is particularly interesting. And we've really, since the late 1980s, have seen a declining share of funding being provided by corporate foundations relative to other types of foundations. In part, of course, this reflects, again, this tremendous growth of individual wealth. We've seen just huge foundations being created and tremendous growth in assets among existing foundations. But other factors were certainly corporate mergers that, in a sense, pulled lessen the connection between where a corporation is located and its philanthropy, the sort of idea of we're a member of the community and we're supporting the growth of that and overall kind of well-being of that community. And then I think another key part is the fact that corporate philanthropy, in becoming more strategic, has become much more aligned with the work that companies are doing. And that is not necessarily, that is not the arts in most cases. So I think both of those factors are at play. All right, well, where are the dollars going by field this is really something that is quite consistent over time. Performing arts and museums have, with one exception last year when multipurpose arts jumped due to a particularly large grant, performing arts and museums have been the top ranked fields by share of grant dollars. And in fact, I mentioned that Geffen grant, the largest we tracked this year, which is for Lincoln Center, so for the performing arts. The largest museum grant we tracked this year was a $28 million operating support award from the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation to the Broad Art Foundation for their art collection and lending activities. As I mentioned, with multidisciplinary arts, which accounts for 12% of grant dollars in the 2022 sample, last year there was a $115 million grant to support the financial stability of New York artists and the organizations that support them, which had almost doubled the share of funding we would see from multipurpose arts. So, this year returned to a much more typical share. The other element I would mention here is at the bottom, other arts, which is accounting for a substantial share of funding. Most of that support are grants that say for arts and culture, or they're for either multipurpose or they're basically they indicate they're for the arts, but they don't say for what aspect of the arts, and that's actually quite a large share of funding. All right, and let's finally look at funding by type of support strategy. So in this chart, we're looking at program, general, and capital support. The blue bars represent share of grant dollars, the green bars share of number of grants. And starting right at the top, the share of funding for program support for arts and culture, that 40%, is very consistent with what we're seeing with overall foundation grant making. That's about 42%. Similarly, share of number of grants. The largest share of grant dollars tends to be targeted to specific programs and projects. For general support, the arts has consistently represented a larger share of funding. There was a real commitment to expanding general operating support decades ago in the arts field, and this has continued, although the differences in share, I would say, are a little more modest than they were perhaps 10 years or so ago. So for example, we have 30% of arts and culture funding in the 2022 sample focused on the arts and culture, whereas for overall grant making, it's about 27%. Similarly, 39% of the share of number of grants, which, think about it, almost 2 out of every 5 arts and culture grants provides unrestricted support, which is really pretty amazing and certainly speaks to the movement toward trust-based philanthropy. But that compares to about 36% for grant making overall. And then finally, for capital and infrastructure support, this is definitely an area where the arts tend to provide more. This is, capital support to fund collections, to build institutions, to create physical structures for the arts. It's about 14% of grant dollars for arts and culture compared to about 6% of grant dollars among overall foundation giving. So there is much more in the snapshot. I hope you'll take a look. There are lists of top funders, shares of giving for the arts. And of course, we'll welcome your questions at the end of this presentation. But at this moment, I will turn you over to Mohja to talk about federal, state, and local support for the arts.
Thank you, Stephen, and I look forward to the 2023 data. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mohja Rhoads, Research Director at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. I am joined by my colleague, Nakyung Rhee, Research Manager. And we are happy to be here to discuss trends in public funding for the arts. We will provide updates on funding that comes from 3 sources: congressional allocations to the NEA, state legislative appropriations to SAAs, and funds allocated by local governments to local arts agencies. And what we will show is that the impact and importance of public dollars is good, and it's clear that it's good. So I will be discussing trends in grant making, and Nakyung will be discussing trends in revenue. Oop, I went one slide too far. So I like to use the metaphor of transportation to talk about the arts ecosystem and how all three levels of government are necessary. We can intuitively understand how for transportation, all three levels are necessary. You have your local roads, you have your state highways and freeways, and you have your federal systems as well. Aviation is one of them, crosses all sorts of boundaries. And so this is an intuitive metaphor, but the arts really truly benefit from integrated efforts across all government levels as well. The local government strengthen arts at the community level, state broader initiatives and infrastructure, and the federal government establishes national policies and cross-state initiatives, amongst other things. And let's see, all three levels of government are connected with real dollars. The federal funds are matched at every level. And also important here are the leadership roles that all play. The leadership role that the NEA plays in building the sector in terms of knowledge and programs is very important and has a trickle-down effect and goes in leadership from the local level also trickles up. So why is public funding necessary? So public funding most certainly complements private and philanthropic funding to expand the reach of the arts. We know that most of the income, most of nonprofits, arts organizations' revenue is derived from people paying for experiences, which is called earned income. And so market forces are very important to consider here. But what's also important to consider is what and who gets left out of these market forces. And so the philanthropic community and the public sector community do tend to fill some of these gaps that are left out by the market forces. Because public funding is derived by taxpayers, public funding is accountable to all citizens, ensuring equitable access to cultural opportunities. And so the public sector serves a very important role in delivering funds and programs to rural and underfunded communities, as well as smaller organizations. And so even though this 9% of public funding, the other slide broke it down by the percentage, 30% philanthropic, 9% public funding. Though 9% of public funding may be modest, these public dollars achieve community access that other funding does not. And all of this information can be found on our recently published advocacy piece called Better Together. So the NEA, states and localities, award funds in every state and jurisdiction and in all congressional districts. And NEA funds reach about 779 more counties than private foundations do. Around 14% of Americans live in rural areas. However, only 6 to 7% of foundation giving reaches rural areas. In contrast, around 11% of NEA-funded projects and 17% of state arts agency awards reach rural areas. 34% of NEA grants and 37% of state arts agency grant dollars go to high poverty communities. And I'm going to flesh this out a little bit more in the upcoming slides. So before I dive into each of these levels, I do want to say there's going to be a variety of years shown. Nakyung's going to focus on fiscal year 2024 and 2025. Here is a slide referring to 2024 data. When I talk about SAA grant making, that'll be 2023 data. And the reason we're using disparate years is we're using in each case the best available data set. So for the NEA, that's 2024. And in terms of SAA grant making, that's fiscal year 2023. So in terms of the National Endowment for the Arts, its budget constitutes a very small portion of the federal government, around 0.003% of the federal budget. And 60% of NEA program funds go to direct grants and 40% go to partnership agreements, which I will discuss in a second. But in terms of direct grants, for fiscal year 2024, 60% of direct grants went to small and medium-sized organizations. Those are organizations with budgets up to $2 million. The grants reached over 2,000 unique communities. 34% of these grants took place in high poverty communities, and 19% of these grants went to rural and small metropolitan communities. 26% went to underserved populations, and those are people with disabilities, institutionalized individuals, and veterans. And the other 40% of the program funds go to partnership agreements. Partnership agreements are very important because they support the locally created state arts agency plans, as well as national and regional services administered by regional arts organizations. And these redistributed funds ensure that federal funds respond to the current needs of communities. And so I will get into some state grant making. So this is data for fiscal year 2023. So for fiscal year 2023, on average, this represented about state arts agency legislative appropriations represented on average about 0.05% of state general fund expenditures. So also a very small percentages going to state arts agencies. Combined SAA revenue was over $1 billion, and this is a special year because there was a lot of pandemic aid and state economies were stronger. So of this $1 billion or over $1 billion, around 4% is an NEA contribution and is represented by NEA contributions, and this is dependent upon states. So some states, the NEA contribution is a smaller portion of their budget. Other states, it represents a significant portion of their budget. But by far, the largest portion of this revenue comes from states themselves, and around 1% comes from private and miscellaneous funds. And from this $1 billion revenue, around 34,000 grants were given to organizations. So operating support, which is very important, it's a very important role that SAAs play. Operating support grants provide flexible and unrestricted funding to grantees. SAAs are critical in delivering this support because it is not available through the NEA. And many communities will not have the philanthropic support or local arts agencies that can provide this operational support. So SAAs are key in delivering this. For 2023, fiscal year 2023, 31% of SAA grant dollars funded operating support for arts organizations that reached over 4,000 communities, and the median award size there was around $13,000. And this operating support reaches across the U.S. Around 75% of the general operating support awards were given to small organizations with budgets under $1 million. And 23% of these organizations were located in a rural setting. And so this map shows not only the reach of operating support grants in general and the spread, but it shows that the spread of small organization operating support awards is even larger, especially reaching throughout rural America. So this slide discusses support to high poverty areas. And so this graph or this figure has three groups. The group that's all the way to the left is the lowest poverty census tract. So those are the wealthiest census tracts in the US. The middle is the middle. And to the right group represents the highest poverty census tracts, so the poorest census tracts. And what's key to look at is to look at the total population that's represented in each of these communities. And so the poorest census tract represents around 22% of the population. And SAAs are doing a very good job in reaching these communities. Close to 37% of grant dollars are going to these communities. Okay, so moving on to local governments. The most recent data we have for them are for 2019. In 2019, 30% of local arts agencies were branches of the municipal or county governments, while the remaining 70% were incorporated as private nonprofits. And of LA local arts agency revenue, about 28% comes from local governments, 27% from corporate support and private donations and grants, 23% earned income, and 12% state and federal funds. And LAAs are critical also in the network. Redistributed partnership agreement funds from the NEA to SAAs to local arts agencies ensure that those closest to the ground are making funding decisions. So in fiscal year 2023, SAAs invested almost 64 million in local arts agencies for a total of 1,700 grants. And these two figures represent how LAAs are using those grants. And there was a little bit of a shift in 2019 to 2023, more of the grants going to operating support in this period of time. So once again, all three levels are necessary. Local government alone can't fully support the arts. There are about 4,500 local arts agencies, but about 91,000 local governments. And only a small percentage of local arts agencies serve multiple counties or cities, and many of them have small budgets or are purely all volunteer. So truly a symbiotic relationship exists amongst all three levels, each of which contributes critical funds, leadership, knowledge, and partnerships. And so this is the end of my portion, but I wanted to reiterate the message of the importance of public and private dollars and the evidence that they are doing good work. We are in a moment where it is useful to remind ourselves of the value of the arts to all communities. With that, I will pass it on to Nakyung.
Okay, thank you, Mohja, and thank you all for continuing to engage with us today. In this segment, we'll explore the breakdown of art appropriations across federal, state, and local level, highlighting the evolving trends and funding shifts from FY24 into FY 2025. So FY 2025 marked a transitional period as pandemic era relief funding, including those from the CARES Act and also the American Rescue Plan Act, came to an end and begins to wind down respectively. These programs provided vital support for the art-sustaining organizations and artists during challenging times. Now with the phase out of this fund, we are seeing a return to pre-pandemic funding structures and a more normalized state budgeting processes. Of course, this is not just about the arts, but the entire economy. And while this signals broader economic stabilizations in some sense, it also presents challenges in maintaining recent funding and performance levels in the sector. Okay, so let's start with the FY24 funding review. At the federal level, the National Endowment for the Arts maintained its previous year's appropriations from Congress of $207 million, ensuring continued support for cultural initiatives and the sector recovery. And state art funding for FY24 totaled $755 million, representing a 22% decrease from the previous year's peak, which was bolstered by pandemic-related funding. This decline was largely due to the conclusion of one-time pandemic-related allocation in large budget states like California and New York. However, despite this drop, funding remained higher pre-pandemic level, as you can see from this chart. Notably, last year, 39 state art agencies reported appropriation increases, with a median rise of over 12%, showing diverse funding strategies and conditions across the state. And turning to the local level, at the local level, we are compelled to use projections as comprehensive FY24 data isn't yet available. We estimated a 22% decline in funding, mirroring the trends observed at the state level, with the total projected to stand at over $860 million. And this estimation reflects historical pattern where changes at the state level often align with the local appropriations. And it is important to note that this projection may differ from the actual circumstances experienced by local art agencies, as funding level depends on local government priorities and economic condition. So the total art appropriation for FY24 across all levels of government stood at $1.8 billion, a 20% decrease from previous year. And the per capita art funding was $5.44 per person, also another 20% drop year over year. This includes 62 cents from federal sources, $2.25 from state appropriations, and $2.57 from local funding. And this per capita serve as a critical metrics for understanding the reach and distribution of public arts investment, showing the real impact of this investment across community. And when we adjust this number for inflation and population growth, this equates to $3.09 per person. So reflecting another like 22% decrease in real dollars. And this decline is more than just a statistic. Despite the nominal stability in funding, inflation and shifting demographics continue widening the gap between appropriations and the potential needs or service level, especially with the rising cost of sustaining art programs. So it emphasized the importance of sustaining and enhancing funding levels. Okay, so the FY24 reflected both stabilizations and challenges in art funding. And looking ahead, FY 2025 is projected to continue this trend of normalization with an anticipated about 7% decline in total appropriations, and it reflecting the full phase out of the pandemic-related support and broader ongoing fiscal constraints. In FY 2025, the total legislative appropriations to state and jurisdictional art agencies are reported as $694 million, representing an 8.1% decrease from FY 2024. Our report, NASAA's revenue report with this data will be released this week, so please check out our communications or the webpage shared in the chat for more detail. Something happens with my slides. Okay. And rather than indicating a broader national trend, this decline of 8% is again largely influenced by adjustments in few large budget states. So you could check more details in our upcoming report. And nonetheless, the art funding has still demonstrated resilience, with 26 state art agencies reporting increase in appropriations and a median growth of 4.5%. And the currently reported funding level still remains above pre-pandemic baseline, indicating sustained state art supports at elevated level compared to pre-2020. And the federal NEA funding remains under discussions with ongoing advocacy efforts, emphasizing the needs for sustained investment. So based on the available data and some projections, we anticipate a 7% decline in total public arts funding for FY25, as I mentioned. And despite this decline, we still see funding remains about 17% higher than pre-pandemic level, signaling continued public commitment to the art. So advocacy will be critical to ensuring access to the art and culture, sustaining creativities, and boosting economic vitality. So thank you all for your attention. That's all from us. I'll now turn the floor back over to our moderator.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to shift into our Q&A section now. I did want to uplift one question that we had in the chat that Nakyung responded to. Someone asked where literary arts were situated in the report. And literary arts fall under the other arts section. And then we also had one in our Q&A. So I'll give our speakers just a second to pop back on. We had another question here in our Q&A that was answered by Mohja, so I'll just read aloud real quick. Someone asked, given the research of the public sector, but the current uncertainty in federal funding, how can the private funders best support public funding? Is there an opportunity to be strategic? Mohja replied, there are likely many innovative ways that the foundations can support the public sector. We see partnerships with foundations and state and regional arts agencies are key, such as NASAA's Creative Aging Initiative with the EA Michelson Foundation. Also, foundations can support initiatives that help advocate for the public sector and public support of the arts. Mohja, would you like to add to that at all, or?
Yeah, just driving home the message that, you know, to sustain federal support for the arts, let's drive the message that that arts serve everyone, and they do good for our communities, and all of the sectors play a pivotal role in this.
Thank you. So just a reminder for folks, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of the toolbar that you should see, or feel free to drop them in the chat. A couple of questions for the group. This is primarily for Mohja and Nakyung. Are there other government agencies besides state arts agencies, local arts agencies, and the NEA that provide funding for arts organizations?
Yeah, I'll answer that. There are several other cultural agencies that receive federal funding. These include the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEH, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the IMLS, the Smithsonian and Kennedy Center in DC, and there are various outlets that fund military bands. Also, there are programs to support arts within certain departments. So there are programs to support arts education in the Department of Education. And there are cultural programs within the Department of State and other departments that will have aspects of their funding that can support the arts. And these are, for example, the USDA has lots of opportunities, arts and culture funding opportunities, and HUD as well.
Thank you. We have a question here in our chat. The change in the NEA guidelines suggests that it will now be used as a PR tool for the administration. Are there opportunities for challenges to this based on the First Amendment? And can GIA and private funders support this kind of challenge?
So I cannot answer that question. The NEA, like all federal agencies, is figuring out what compliance looks like. And should you have questions that you want answered, I orient you towards a webinar that will be hosted by the NEA on February 18th. And so they will likely be able to answer more questions there, but I direct you to the NEA for those questions.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll be sure to get a link to that webinar and send it out to registrants after this. Another question for the group is, do the public sector and private sector serve different roles in the arts ecosystem? Stephen?
Yeah, I can answer that if Stephen wants to dovetail. That would be great. So yeah, some of this was covered in my presentation. Philanthropic contributions play a significant role in the arts ecosystem. Their granting comprises a very large amount of total dollars that support the bottom line of many arts organizations. And these funds help organizations innovate. However, philanthropic funds do tend to be concentrated in urban communities. They tend to focus on the funders' priorities, and they tend to be focused also in certain geographies. And as we've seen, they tend to go to larger institutions, super large. So the public funders have different goals and they have different mission statements, and their goals and mission statements are to serve everyone in their jurisdiction. So as such, we see that SAAs have smaller grant sizes, and they have smaller grant sizes so they can reach more organizations and communities. Public sector grant applications themselves also serve a function because they encourage organizations to have programs or apply for funds that are integrated with their communities as well. So I don't know if Stephen has any follow-up there.
I think, yeah, that's all right. I mean, I think that is, for foundation support, there's an opportunity to fund. We've seen some comments around advocacy. What can funders do to support advocacy? There's certainly a role to be played there. However, are they providing the same level of consistency in terms of funding as local arts agencies and states arts agencies? That's a question. Just having looked at local arts agency and United Arts funding for GIA several years ago, a lot of that funding is also supporting the majors. So there will be grants going to smaller organizations, but that's a factor as well. I mean, I think in the particular moment, there's such a wait and see. I mean, where I think from other types of, I would put in the category of crisis response fund, periods of crisis, whether it was economic downturns, other things, foundations have shown themselves to be really rather consistent funders. Very focused on shoring up their longtime grantees, ensuring they can make it through. So I think that's a real positive. It's also, with every, economic downturn, there's a question, are foundations all going to suddenly become human services funders? Even with the COVID pandemic, we saw, additional resources going out, foundations funding in ways that they wouldn't typically to provide additional support, but their core priorities, those continued. So I think that's where foundations are especially important, which is part of why I find it worrisome that it seems newer foundations aren't engaging in supporting the arts as well, because this point, I would say, goes kind of across issue areas. Education funders are going to keep funding education even in a crisis period, and that can be really critical in times where other sources of support may become less predictable.
Thank you. In the chat, we have a question. Are there case studies for local arts agencies building funding/matching relationships with local government? My region of Pennsylvania has no budget allocation for the arts at the city or county level, and with limited foundation funding, this might be our path forward.
I'm going to say yes, there are. Off the top of my head, I cannot come up with one, but we will make sure to get back to you on that. So, and as for everybody else here, you feel free to email Nakyung or myself with any question that you have, and we'll get back to you. So that's one that we're going to have to get back into that, because off the top of my head, I cannot come up with an example, but I know there are for sure, and this is a very, very, very good strategy.
And also, I think the Americans for the Art could be some good resources to
That's
get
right.
more research and some case studies, more action-oriented case study about the local relationships. So I'll recommend you to reach out or just check their webpage.
Question in our Q&A section here. Stephen's research seemed to illustrate that foundation support is not moving at the speed of urgency, and the post-pandemic moment seems to be a return to quote-unquote normal. Any predictions for what we may see in the data ahead? The narrative and the data do not seem to align.
I'm not sure. I'm not quite clear on the last part of that, the narrative and the data not aligning. I mean, in terms of the trend line, I think the trend line is going to continue to trend gradually downward. I don't, I just don't see a movement at this moment. I mean, I'm not sure we fully understand where the disconnect is between newer donors and arts and cultures, and arts and culture. Was it a generational shift? The silent generation and baby boomers were really focused on institution building in arts and culture. And, institutions have been built. The arts are being consumed differently. And so relatively younger donors aren't thinking about it the same way. And there's not the same sort of social cachet that came from being supporters of the arts. But by the same token, I feel like in many ways, the arts have become that much more embedded in all of our day-to-day lives with social media, with kind of ready electronic access. So it's an interesting irony. And partly, I think there's a way that, as I said in my remarks, in my presentation, the arts are fundamental to social change, social justice. And I feel like there's a way that that case may not be being made clearly to relatively newer donors about how fundamental the arts are to maintaining democratic institutions and, advancing the well-being of all people. So, I think there's more to be learned there. And I think there's a real opportunity for figuring out where donors are at and how to meet them there and bring them along.
Yeah, and just building on that a little bit, because we had the earlier question about how the private sector can support public funding. Do you have any insight or ideas on how private foundations can be in dialogue with one another to come up with like more strategic ways to increase their funding to the arts?
It's interesting because I would say two thoughts. One, Grantmakers in the Arts has been the locus of building foundation support for the arts and maintaining that support. So I give you all a lot of credit. I wouldn't want to see where we'd be without GIA. By the same token, I think there's, I think of the 2009. Foundations really came together under the auspices of various philanthropy-serving organizations to respond to changes that were happening at the federal level. And there was a lot of coordination in a way that I hadn't seen before. So I do think that there is an opportunity in this moment to see if that type of coordination comes together in ways that builds attention. I mean, I think about, sort of the philanthropy serving organization, Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. And they partnered with numerous regional associations and national philanthropy serving organizations to educate donors and provide information. I wonder about those kind of opportunities for really collaborating in this moment, and really going forward for the good of the field, for the next 20 years in terms of kind of building those connections, really sort of doing that basic work of building understanding, building connection, figuring out priorities, and really showing how the arts are essential and can be critical to advancing goals across a range of issue areas.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I want to uplift a couple comments we have here in the chat. Alejandro said, I am wondering, though, if this is the new generation of wealth is more interested in preserving their wealth than giving back to society, which is why the arts may be seen as a tactic for propaganda as opposed to a public good to support social justice, as you were describing. And Nadia actually dropped a link, and we'll collect all the links in the chat and share them out with folks after. The work of the folks like resource generation seem increasingly important to Alejandro's point. And so we are just about at time, but I do want to give our speakers one more moment if anyone had anything they would like to add before we conclude.
You know what, I would just jump in on that one. And this is a broad generalization. Newer money tends to be more conservative money.
Mm.
And it's really after they've had it for a while that they realize, oh, this is not a business transaction. Social change it's not pressing widgets. And so it may take time for some of those donors to figure out how change actually happens in the sector. The key thing is that we in the sector actually have pathways to say, when you get there, here's a way you can do it and achieve the kind of impact you're after.
Thank you. Mohja or Nakyung, anything to add?
I'll just add that, let's all get together to spread the message of how important the arts are and how they serve all of our communities. So the better we can have a united front, the better we can push through unstable times or uncertain times.
Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you as well to our technician today, Jess. And today's webinar provided valuable insights into the latest findings on support for arts and culture, shedding light on funding trends, gaps, and opportunities within the field. By analyzing these data-driven perspectives, we can better understand how resources are distributed and identify ways to advance more equitable and sustainable investment in the arts. GIA remains committed to equipping the philanthropic sector with knowledge and tools to foster a funding landscape prioritizing racial equity, cultural vitality, and community-centered impact. Together, we can ensure that the arts and culture thrive through informed, strategic, and justice-centered support. As a reminder, everyone will be getting all the materials, the speaker materials, as well as a recording of today's session. And we hope that you can join us on February 25th for the Arts in Changing Political Landscapes, featuring Dr. Liz Dykman and Vanessa Cooksey of the Regional Arts Commission. And if you have just a moment, we'd love to hear feedback from today. There's a survey link in the chat, and there is a QR code that will also be popping up in just a moment on the screen. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.